Hi, this is Brenda Finucane. I'm a licensed genetic counselor and also the Associate Director and a clinical researcher at Geisinger's Autism and Developmental Medicine Institute in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm going to be talking today about putting genetic diagnoses, including those involving chromosome 16p and also 1q, as well as other genetic diagnoses, into perspective in the school setting. So I'll start by saying I have no financial conflicts to disclose related to this talk, and just to give you a little perspective on where I am located with Geisinger, we are out in central Pennsylvania. I'll start by talking about neurodevelopmental disorders, and this is the current term that's being used to encompass a number of different conditions that start in the developmental period, early childhood, and affect brain functioning. And these can include things like global developmental delay, as the term is used in a young child, intellectual disability, which is what was in the past known as mental retardation. Autism spectrum disorder can encompass things that involve motor function, such as cerebral palsy, etc. And so neurodevelopmental disorders is really a broad term that involves anything that affects brain function and starts during the developmental period. Now, one of the things that we know related to neurodevelopmental disorders is that there's often a lot of confusion in schools around different genetic diagnoses when they're made in a child and the types of diagnoses that are used for eligibility in school systems. So, for example, in this slide there are 3 children, and these are preschoolers. They would be in a developmental preschool, let's say, because they've been identified as having some degree of developmental delay, and all 3 of them have been identified as well as having an autism spectrum disorder. However, when you look at their genetic diagnoses, these 3 children all have completely different genetic disorders, which in the genetics world we would say have nothing to do with each other. The 22q11.2 deletion syndrome in the girl on the right, duplication 15q syndrome for the girl in the middle, and Fragile X syndrome for the boy on the left. But in the school setting, they would be saying that these children all have developmental delay and autism spectrum disorder. And so from a school perspective, a teacher, an aide, a therapist might say, well, these 3 kids all have the same conditions. If you look at the next slide, these are 3 older school-age children who might, let's say, be in a learning support classroom in a regular school, and they might be receiving specialized instruction for certain academics, and maybe they're included with typical classmates for other classes in the school district. But all 3 of these individuals have been diagnosed with an intellectual disability, an autism spectrum disorder, and an anxiety disorder. And yet when you look at their genetic diagnoses, all 3 have very different genetic conditions, which have different genes involved, different manifestations physically, and also different inheritance considerations. So the boy on the left has the 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, the boy in the middle has Fragile X syndrome, and the girl on the end has Smith-Magenis syndrome. So what's going on here? We have school districts thinking about diagnoses in a very different way than the genetic diagnoses that these children are receiving. And so what we can say is that the genetic diagnoses reflect what's called etiology. And when we talk about etiology, we mean the underlying cause. And we now know that developmental disorders, things like autism, intellectual disability, cerebral palsy, they're symptoms for which there are many different causes or etiologies. And it's now very clear that genetic and medical factors play a role in causing most developmental disorders. And what's happening with regard to the confusion in schools is that schools are often looking, most often, at the behavioral and symptom diagnoses that make students eligible for certain services and programs. The genetic diagnoses are looking at the underlying causes for those behaviors and those delays that make up the symptom diagnoses. So one way of thinking about this is that a behavioral diagnosis like autism or even intellectual disability tells you what are you seeing on the outside. An ideological diagnosis tells you why. So if a child has an intellectual disability and an autism spectrum disorder, those are symptom diagnoses for which the underlying cause could be Fragile X syndrome, an etiological diagnosis. Now this has become very important in recent years because we're learning more and more about the genetic underpinnings of neurodevelopmental disorders and realizing that almost half the time there is an underlying genetic component. And that's conservative. Our ability to look at genes and sequences is really just starting to pick up steam. So even now, with the tools we have available today, such as clinical whole exome sequencing, otherwise known as WES, we can figure out an underlying cause of intellectual disability, autism, other neurodevelopmental disorders in up to 40% of individuals. And again, there's a lot we still have to learn about diagnosing genetic conditions. So certainly genetic causes are extremely important when we think about neurodevelopmental disorders, and we now have the ability to identify them. So now we do have children and adults being diagnosed with both genetic diagnoses and then a whole array of symptom diagnoses that are based on intellectual functioning, behavior, etc. The other important thing to know about genetic causes is that the same genetic underpinning or cause can result in many different symptoms. So if you look at this table here, you'll see the most common deletions that are found in samples that are sent for chromosomal microarray testing, which is a type of genetic testing. So these are not general population samples. Most people in the general population don't have blood samples sent for microarray testing, so it's obviously skewed toward individuals who have neurodevelopmental symptoms or disorders. But in that sample, about 1 in every 167 of those samples, for example, would be diagnosed as having a 22q11.2 deletion, would be found to have that deletion, and 16p11.2 deletions are found in 1 in 241 samples that are sent for clinical evaluation using chromosomal microarray. So these are very, very commonly diagnosed conditions. They get rarer and rarer as you go down this table, and there are hundreds to thousands of different other types of chromosomal findings that are not quite as common, but the ones on this table are the most common. But what's interesting is that if you look, for example, in 16p11.2 deletions, in some of those samples, the indication for sending the sample was intellectual disability or a developmental delay. Another sample might have been sent because the person had an autism spectrum disorder. Another child, it might have been sent because of epilepsy. If you look at the 7q11.23 deletions, for example, it could be the same set of symptoms that prompted sending the sample. You can also see schizophrenia as an indication for sending some of these samples. So even childhood onset disorders, but also adult onset psychiatric disorders are sometimes showing the same genetic underpinning, which is really important, and it tells us that those symptom diagnoses are really just our ways to look at what we see on the outside. But the genetics, of course, doesn't know that we've created these symptom categories on the outside. It just knows that it causes some kind of brain dysfunction. Why should we care about the underlying cause? And for families of individuals who have genetic diagnoses, it may seem obvious why you would care about it, but for many professionals and even families who have never had genetic testing, they often wonder, why should we care about this? This is very true in schools as well, where school districts and school personnel might say, well, why should we even care about underlying causes? It's never really been part of the thinking of schools to wonder about the underlying cause. Well, there are a number of different reasons. One has to do with genetic counseling for families. So I'm a genetic counselor by training, and I often will work not only with parents of young children, but also adult siblings, for example. And let's say I have a 30-year-old woman who comes to me and says, my brother, who's 27 years old, has an intellectual disability and autism. I'm getting ready to plan a family. What's the chance that I'll have a child who also has an intellectual disability or autism? Well, if I don't know what caused her brother's disability in the first place, it's very hard for me to give focused information to that woman about her chance of having a child with the same kind of problem. I can give her general statistics, but it's much more powerful if I actually know what caused her brother's disability, and then I can give her a much more specific answer as to whether that's likely to recur in the family in future generations. Another reason why knowing the cause is important, and this is, I think, an equally important reason, is that it can often alleviate the guilt and misconceptions that parents carry around when they don't know the cause. Many parents, will go through every step of the pregnancy and ask questions when they don't have an explanation for why their son or daughter has a developmental disability. A mother might say, I had a glass of champagne at the, holiday party when I was pregnant, and I didn't realize I was pregnant with my son, and she wonders if that caused it. You might have other parents who, blamed doctors for birth trauma, or might have just thought that it might have something to do with the way the child was raised after birth, and all of this leads to guilt and misconceptions. And the fact is that most developmental disorders are not related to anything a parent or a family member has done, and it really can alleviate a lot of the guilt that families often feel. These are medical conditions that occur and really are not anything that a parent could have caused or prevented. It's important to know about underlying causes because in some cases it can allow us to anticipate the medical needs of individuals with a particular genetic disorder. Down syndrome, for example, which is a well-known genetic cause of intellectual disability, is associated with a number of different medical issues that can arise in childhood and then later in adulthood as well. And there are actually customized healthcare guidelines for individuals with Down syndrome so that we can monitor the health care and customize it to that particular disorder. There are other disorders that are fairly well known for which there are healthcare guidelines, and then there are newer disorders, including the 16p11.2 deletions and duplications, for example, for which we don't yet know everything we need to know about these conditions, but in the future there will be healthcare guidelines that help us better understand what we should be looking for. Because people with these different genetic conditions are subject potentially to having other health problems that are different from what you would find from typical peers. So it helps us to anticipate medical needs. One of the things for several genetic disorders that we're starting to be able to see is that they can provide us with insights into behavior and learning styles, and that can be very, very important. There are some genetic conditions that are consistently associated with self-injurious behaviors, for example, or anxiety, or certain types of severe autism spectrum disorders, that if we know that these behavioral patterns are seen in the disorder, we know to look for them, and we potentially can look to intervene earlier and in a more targeted way. Targeted research is important. I mean, there has been for decades a lot of research on autism, intellectual disability, other types of neurodevelopmental disorders, but it's general. So think about autism spectrum disorder as a category in which there are many, many hundreds to thousands of different underlying causes, many that we know of and many that we don't yet know about. And what we're doing when we do autism research is really studying the outside manifestations or the symptoms, but we're really not looking at it in at the next level where we're looking at a specific etiology or a cause. So if you can get to that level where you know the underlying cause, the research is much more targeted. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the importance of condition-specific support organizations that really help drive the targeted research and also bring families together whose children have the same underlying genetic condition. And it really is a much more focused type of research, a much more focused type of support. So how did we get to the point where we've got all these differences between behavioral and genetic diagnoses and different perceptions of what a person's diagnoses might mean? Well, there have been three main disciplines, if you will, have been interested in neurodevelopmental disorders for many decades, and these include psychiatry, psychology, and genetics. Psychiatry has been interested in terms of behavioral disorders and the use of medications to treat different behavioral disorders, and so psychiatry has been looking at neurodevelopmental disorders through that lens. And the psychiatric diagnostic system, as I'll describe in a few minutes, is really the one that schools use primarily to determine eligibility for school services. Genetics has been interested for many decades in neurodevelopmental disorders, but always with an eye toward etiology. What is the underlying cause of these neurodevelopmental disorders? And that's really been the focus. Can we figure out what the underpinning is? And the third group, psychology, it's really been the dominant group in terms of trying to understand measurements of intelligence, like IQ, also looking at behavior and what kind of environmental triggers are driving behavior, what kind of supports can be put in place to help a child with behavioral differences and problems. And so psychology really has been looking at it through its own lens in terms of behavior and intellectual functioning, but things that are related to everyday functioning in individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders. And each of these three areas has its own expertise, but unfortunately over the last several decades until fairly recently, these three clinical disciplines haven't really been talking to each other or sharing their research findings. They've all been kind of looking at it through their own lens, and it's only been recently that these three worlds have come together. And so it's not surprising that we're at a point now where you may have a child with an underlying genetic disorder who also has multiple behavioral and psychiatric symptom disorders, and yet there's confusion around how all these diagnoses fit in with each other. In the school setting, and this is as true today, I think, as it was 20 years ago, what we often find is that the etiological diagnoses or the cause diagnoses, genetic syndromes, are often considered irrelevant. So families may, gather a lot of information about their child's genetic diagnoses, and when they go to the school, schools are not used to dealing with those diagnoses typically, and often they'll send that information down to the nurses department because, of course, that's a medical condition. And instead of really looking into the genetic or etiological diagnoses, schools typically will use the educational and psychiatric diagnoses to determine the services and also the treatment approaches. So, for example, you might have a child with a 22q11.2 deletion as a genetic diagnosis, and yet that information is really not looked at as anything that will help drive services and treatment approaches. Instead, the child's learning disability and autism features might be the ones that determine the placement and what approaches are used. And those are important, of course, the symptom diagnoses, but more and more the genetic diagnoses are also providing us with insights on how to treat and how to diagnose other conditions and monitor other conditions in kids with genetic diagnoses. So the psychiatric diagnostic system is the primary system that is used to determine school eligibility with some differences, but psychiatric diagnoses sound very scary, I think, particularly to parents of young children. There are childhood onset and adult onset psychiatric diagnoses. And in an effort to demystify what this means, I'll just describe these diagnoses and emphasize that these are all symptom diagnoses. They're based on observed, recognizable patterns of human behavior. That's all a psychiatric diagnosis is. It's a diagnosis that involves behavior and gets diagnosed using criteria that are in a manual called the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And these are clinically determined behavioral diagnoses, meaning that it's what you observe on the outside that makes the diagnosis, and the criteria are spelled out in the DSM. These are not diagnoses that are made with laboratory tests. So you don't do a blood test for schizophrenia, for example. You don't do some kind of urine analysis to find out if somebody has autism. You observe the behaviors. You learn more about when they had their onset and what areas they're affecting, and that's how these diagnoses get made. Now, this doesn't mean they're not important. Psychiatric diagnoses are really important for determining eligibility for services in schools, for example, and also to a great extent determining which classes of medications, for example, might be most effective for treating some of the behaviors. However, they are not, and they never were intended to pay attention really to underlying causes. That was not the purpose. For the most part, psychiatric diagnoses really were made as a way to identify behavioral patterns because we really didn't have technology to look at underlying causes in the past. And now we do have that technology. So in terms of psychiatric diagnoses, here are some common ones that often get diagnosed among individuals with genetic causes, and these include ADHD, ASD or autism, intellectual disability, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, what's interesting when we think about genetic and diagnoses and psychiatric diagnoses in individuals in school settings and children as they get older is that these diagnoses tend to accumulate over time. And so what we'll see is that a child may get diagnosed early in life, for example, with autism, may have some developmental delays and patterns of behavior that gets diagnosed with autism. The preschooler gets plugged in, hopefully, to a developmental preschool where they're being given early intervention and hopefully some targeted interventions for autism. As that child gets older, the child may manifest some problems with attention. And in order to sort of look at treatments, they may say, well, he really meets criteria for ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And the autism diagnosis doesn't necessarily go away, and as the child gets older, there may be other diagnoses that are added to this child's repertoire or list of diagnoses. Now, I realize that psychiatrists never intended their manual or their diagnostic system to be used in this way, but practically speaking, this is how it does get used in kids who have complex behavioral and intellectual disabilities, and very often that includes genetic diagnoses. So let's say somewhere along the line that child also starts to show some mood instability and maybe gets diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And when that child is school age, there may be noted to be significant intellectual disability, and then maybe some obsessive compulsive tendencies later on. And again, these diagnoses may get made and often are made either to determine eligibility for certain services and or to determine medications that might help with the behavioral presentation. Later on, the individual might get diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. He's probably anxious because he has too many diagnoses. And then at somewhere along the line, this individual, maybe as a child or maybe much later, gets diagnosed with a genetic diagnosis, the 16p11.2 deletion, for example. And so we can refer to this as diagnostic alphabet soup. And the reaction of a parent when she learns that her child has yet another diagnosis is understandable. I think when I deal with a lot of parents of adolescents and adults, they've frequently had this reaction that every year something new is cropping up. Of course behavior changes. All of us change in our behavior with age, but so do kids with special needs. And as more diagnoses are made, I think it kind of makes people wonder what is the value of even getting all these diagnoses. They start to lose their meaning. Another important concept is that in this situation, for example, you may have families, but also professionals, and I definitely have seen this in school systems, who perceive that this is a child who has 7 different things. And I've heard people say, how did this poor kid get so unlucky as to have intellectual disability and all these psychiatric disorders and also has a genetic diagnosis? And really that kind of thinking is flawed because this child does not have 7 different things. This child has one thing. This child has the 16p11.2 deletion, which as a genetic underpinning results in patterns of behavior and learning that can be classified into these other diagnoses, symptom diagnoses. So the child has one underlying condition which results in patterns of behavior and learning that fall out over time into different psychiatric and school diagnoses. So I'm going to talk about some different diagnoses that one can see in kids with various genetic disorders, and particularly the 16p11.2 deletions and duplications, and also the 1q21 deletions and duplications. But these are very common behavioral diagnoses that are found with a whole host of different genetic underpinnings. So autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, has several definitions, but one way of summing it up could be to say it's a complex disorder of brain development that's characterized by difficulties in social interaction, verbal and nonverbal communication, as well as repetitive behaviors. And these could be things like hand flapping or twirling string, etc. And so ASD is a behavioral diagnosis. There are as many different reasons for ASD as there are, let's say, for intellectual disability. There are thousands of different causes, and many causes that we do not know about. And they cause a problem with brain functioning so that on the outside, what we see is a collection of behaviors that we recognize and call ASD. So in the past, up until 2013, ASD, what we now know as autism spectrum disorder, was under a category of conditions known as PDD, or pervasive developmental disorders, and this was just the previous version of that diagnostic manual, the DSM, which changed in 2013 to version 5. And when it changed, PDD was eliminated, and Asperger's disorder was also eliminated as a specific diagnosis, as was PDD-NOS, which is a more general term where there were some autistic symptoms but not enough to meet full criteria for autism. So all of those different disorders, autistic disorder, Asperger's, PDD-NOS, were put under autism spectrum disorder. There's a specific genetic disorder known as Rett's disorder or Rett syndrome, which was originally in the DSM as a psychiatric diagnosis because people didn't know what the cause was, and it was only diagnosed behaviorally. And interestingly, now that we know what the underlying genetic cause of Rett syndrome is, it's no longer in the DSM, and it's not considered an autism spectrum disorder. It is actually a genetic underpinning for autism, intellectual disability, and a number of other symptom disorders. So how do you diagnose an autism spectrum disorder? Well, there are specific criteria, and these are straight out of the diagnostic manual, and there are a number of different assessments that clinicians use to see if kids meet criteria that are spelled out in the DSM. So, for example, for autism spectrum disorder, one of the key areas that would be looked at are social communication and social interaction. And so a child who has persistent deficits in social communication and interaction across multiple contexts, different areas, and manifested in several different ways is described in the DSM. So this may be a child who has problems with social or emotional reciprocity. In other words, when you go to give the child a hug, maybe the child doesn't hug back, or you're not getting that interaction or that reciprocal response from a child mild in the social and emotional domain. You may have a child who has problems with nonverbal communicative behaviors. Maybe they don't point or use other gestures that show that they're trying to engage another person into their world. They may have problems in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. So you may have some of these symptoms, and this could be an area where we have problems and can diagnose an autism spectrum disorder. Of course, there are differences among children and adults to the degree that they manifest this particular area. So you may have somebody who's really got profound deficits across these social communication and interaction domains, but you may have somebody else who's got some mild deficits here, but they both have autism spectrum disorder, and they both may have very different underlying causes. The second area of symptoms in autism has to do with restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. So you have to have at least two of the following areas of symptoms. Stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, those are things like hand flapping, or the stereotyped use of objects or speech. So repeating things over and over again, or repeating what other people say, lining toys up, etc. Insistence on sameness and routine, highly restricted interest. So we've all known about or hear about, a child, for example, who is obsessed or really focused just on a particular area, such as, trains, for example, and will only speak about trains and really tries to direct the conversation around trains. Now, all of us in the population, typical people as well, can sometimes get hyper-focused on certain areas of interest, and it doesn't mean we all have autism, but it's the degree to which this interferes with the ability to interact with the surroundings and other people that makes it more of a problem with autism than it is in the general population, where many of us do have different patterns of interests that we might get hyper-focused on. A third area has to do with, or a third set of criteria have to do with the onset and the severity of these symptoms. So the symptoms have to be present during the early developmental period, prior to age 3 or so, where these are starting to emerge. If somebody at age 20 has a brain trauma, for example, and otherwise was functioning fine, but then after that starts to show some of these behaviors, that person doesn't have autism. This is a developmental disorder. They're here in the early developmental period. It's also important to recognize that these symptoms have to cause significant impairment in your ability to function. And as I said, everybody in the human population is somewhere along a spectrum where they either are more or less responsive to social interaction. Some of us are a little more shy than others. Some are more outgoing. So everybody is somewhere along that continuum. It's only when you get to the far end of the continuum where the social interaction is really causing impairment in your ability to function that you might have somebody who's on the autism spectrum. And then finally, if you have somebody who's got a significant intellectual disability that results in them not being tuned into others in their environment or not interacting in a way that we would expect, it's possible that it's due more to the intellectual disability than actually due to an autism spectrum disorder. And it's hard often to tease out, is it due to just general low intellectual functioning, or is it an actual autism spectrum disorder? And there's still a fair amount of debate about that when you get into fairly low levels of intellectual functioning. And there are different severity levels, of course, for autism as anything else. You may have somebody who's very mildly affected. In the past, we used to refer to Asperger disorder as, somebody who often had average to above average intelligence, didn't have an intellectual disability component, but had the behavioral aspects of autism. Asperger doesn't get diagnosed anymore because it's not really part of the diagnostic system anymore. It's been kind of taken under the general umbrella of ASD, or autism spectrum disorder. But the different levels of severity are really based on how much support does somebody need in their daily lives. And level 3 would be the highest level of support needed to somebody at level 1 who may need some support but may have a fairly high level of independence as well. So the other diagnosis, symptom diagnosis that's often part of what we see in kids with different genetic syndromes or conditions is intellectual disability. This is the disability that was formerly known up until a few years ago as mental retardation. That term has fallen out of favor, and now the term that gets used is intellectual disability. And the definition includes a number of different criteria. So again, it's a symptom diagnosis. There's no blood test for intellectual disability, and it involves three main areas. One, you have to have deficits in intellectual functioning, and this gets measured on an IQ test. The average IQ in the general population is around 100, and if you have an IQ of 70 or below, then you may meet criteria for an intellectual disability. The second bullet here says, though, that even if you have an IQ of 70 or below, you also need to have some deficits or impairments in what's called adaptive functioning. This means, that you're functioning in your environment, your ability to be independent in your environment, and these include things like communication, social skills, your personal independence, your ability to dress yourself, make a meal for yourself, etc., your school or work functioning. So you have to have some problem in the areas of adaptive functioning in addition to a low IQ in order to meet criteria for an intellectual disability. Now, usually in today's society, if you have an IQ of 70 or below, you are going to have some impairments in adaptive functioning. This was not always true many decades ago when, for example, life was not quite as complicated as it is now. I mean, now just to function in your community, very often you need skills like being able to use an ATM machine, and you've been able to do some banking, etc. So life has gotten more technologically challenging, so that having an IQ of 70 or below most often will lead to impairments in your ability to function in today's high-tech society. The third criterion for intellectual disability is that these symptoms have to be present during the developmental period up to about age 18 years when development is still being completed. And, I think this last one particularly shows us that intellectual disability is an artificial construct if you think about it. I mean, it's something that we had to come up with criteria for. And it's really a way of identifying who are the 1 to 2% of people in the population who require extra supports. That's why this diagnosis even exists. It's not a biological diagnosis, it's a social diagnosis. And the fact that it's got a cutoff during which these symptoms must occur tells us that it's an artificial or an invented diagnosis. Now, it has importance because the ability to diagnose somebody or say that somebody has an intellectual disability allows us to determine their eligibility for important services. But beyond that, it's not a biological diagnosis. So just to give you an example, let's say that you have a 17-year-old who has deficits in intellectual functioning and problems with adaptive functioning, and that 17-year-old had those symptoms occur just recently when he had a car accident, let's say, had been developing normally up until age 17, ended up with a car accident with brain insult, and then ended up with these areas of deficit and an IQ below 70. Well, that individual, because this happened prior to the age of 17 or around age 17, would meet criteria for intellectual disability. If you have a 25-year-old, on the other hand, who was functioning typically and got into the same car wreck and ended up with deficits in intellectual functioning, deficits in adaptive functioning, that person would not have intellectual disability. That person has a completely other type of diagnosis known as traumatic brain injury, which involves a different funding stream and doesn't have the same types of protections that people with intellectual disability do. So I think that points out the artificiality, if you will, of the diagnosis of intellectual disability. Important to keep in mind, because I think parents, when they hear about intellectual disability or in the past heard about mental retardation, it was quite a scary thought. And in fact, you need to remember that these are symptom diagnoses that reflect what you're seeing. And these are not necessarily things that we should be, necessarily concerned about. Your child is your child. Your child is functioning as he or she is, and if a diagnosis of intellectual disability gets made, let's say at age 5, your child has not changed. It's really putting a name on what you're already seeing. The other thing that's artificial about the diagnosis of intellectual disability is that it's based on IQ scores. So this is a curve of IQs. If we took 1,000 people in the population and gave them IQ tests, the average IQ of people in the United States is 100. And you see that if there's a cutoff of 70 there, below that cutoff we have intellectual disability, and actually 30 points above the average IQ at 130 is where the cutoff for gifted is made by most school districts, etc. And really, when you think about IQ, the average IQ of people in the United States is 100, not because there's anything special about people in the United States or elsewhere, but because the tests are made so that the average IQ will always be 100. That's how the tests are designed. The cutoff of 70 is artificial. We determined that the cutoff for intellectual disability would be 70, and the cutoff for gifted would be on the other side. Equally, a decision could be made at some point in the future that the cutoff for intellectual disability could be higher or lower. In fact, there was a point at some point in the past where the cutoff for intellectual disability, or what was called mental retardation, was actually an IQ of 85. An IQ of 85 includes a lot more people than the cutoff of 70. And in fact, at that point, for a couple of years, when the cutoff for mental retardation was determined to be 85, that meant that 16% of the U.S. population met criteria for mental retardation. And then it was decided that that cost way too much money to support all those people. It was a good intent that we would let more people be eligible for services, but really the reality is that that's an awful lot of people, 16% of the population. And then the criteria were changed again down to 70, 30 points below the average of 100. And at that point, all those people who previously had been diagnosed with mental retardation did not have it anymore. They were cured, if you will, of their mental retardation. So I say that in a humorous way, but the fact is it points out the artificiality of our diagnosis of intellectual disability or mental retardation. Not that it's not important. It does determine eligibility for services, but really it's not a biological symptom. It is really a reflection of us trying to understand who needs supports in our society. So the last diagnosis I do want to mention, and I think it's important to mention this because families who are reading about their child's genetic diagnosis may often come across the term schizophrenia, and it's a really frightening one for many families. So let's demystify this as well. First of all, schizophrenia, like autism spectrum disorder, is a psychiatric diagnosis based on symptoms. And schizophrenia is a brain disorder that affects how people think, feel, and perceive the world. And the hallmark symptom is psychosis, such as experiencing hallucinations, often auditory hallucinations, so voices that they'll hear in their heads, and also delusions. So these are false beliefs, like somebody who believes that she is the President of the United States when in fact she is not. So this is a brain disorder. It has its obvious onset typically later in adolescence and early adulthood. And so it's different than autism spectrum where that presents in the early developmental period. However, they're both developmental brain disorders in that they have their roots and their underpinnings in just the way the brain is formed early on. So the typical age of onset for schizophrenia is 18 years in males and 25 years in women, and you can have a variety of different symptoms that go along with this. I think it's important just to point out, though, that again, there are many genetic underpinnings to schizophrenia. We know many of them now. We don't know all of them, but just in the same way that we know many underpinnings to intellectual disability and autism. And the same genetic underpinnings, such as a 22q11.2 deletion, for example, can result in schizophrenia in some people, autism in other people, intellectual disability in some people, combinations of those symptoms, and the same thing with the 1q21 deletions and duplications, for example. So these are symptom diagnoses. Sometimes it's scary to read about them, but again, these are symptoms of some underpinning. And I would say that families who have children or adult sons and daughters with genetic conditions and who know already what the genetic underpinning is are really in a much more powerful position once you know that, and know that these symptom diagnoses are stemming from that underlying genetic cause. For a couple of reasons, I think that's true. One is that you can benefit from targeted research on your particular genetic disorder of interest. I think the other thing that we know is that, for example, in schizophrenia, most people with schizophrenia, it has its onset later in adolescence, early adulthood, and people don't really know what's happening. I mean, all of a sudden there's a change in behavior. There might be delusions and hallucinations, etc. And very often it takes a long time before these diagnoses are made and the individual is treated. So, for example, on average, people with schizophrenia, it may take 1 to 2 years before they get accurately diagnosed with this psychiatric disorder. And by that time, they have had multiple episodes of psychosis or hallucinations, and they've been living with this condition untreated for a number of years before they get treatment. On the other hand, if you have a child who has the 22q11.2 deletion, for example, we know that 25% of those kids will develop schizophrenia later on in life. So that if a child enters adolescence, for example, and they have that genetic diagnosis and starts to have behavioral differences and talks about things that are really unusual for them, those families, those parents are going to be in a much better position to immediately say, hey, what is this? Let's see if we can find treatment. And the bottom line is schizophrenia is a treatable psychiatric disorder. And the best prognosis for people with schizophrenia is when you can catch it early and treat it early and keep it under good treatment. The worst prognoses are for people who go for years without getting treatment. So although it's very scary and a scary topic, I think that knowing about a genetic diagnosis which gives somebody a vulnerability potentially to developing schizophrenia, at least you have a little bit of a heads up that if there are changes in behavior, you need to be on it right away. You need to be able to get in and potentially treat this early and have a much better prognosis than if it was let go for a long time. So in conclusion, I think what we can say generally about genetic diagnoses in the school setting is that there's a lot of diagnostic confusion. Teachers, therapists, others are equally confused about how genetic diagnoses fit into the other diagnoses that are found in school systems and adult service agencies. So psychiatric and behavioral symptoms are symptom diagnoses, and they're found in association with many genetic disorders, including the 16p11.2 and 1q21.1 deletions and duplications, and other copy number variations, such as other genetic disorders. It's important to know the difference between causes and symptoms, and it's important for parents and professionals to understand the distinction, that if a child has a 16p11.2 deletion and multiple symptom diagnoses, one is a cause, the others are symptoms. And often it's the parents who need to educate school personnel about the difference between causes and symptoms. Educational and behavioral diagnoses are important, and I don't mean to dismiss their importance, because it's those diagnoses and not necessarily the genetic diagnoses that determine the eligibility and services within the school setting. We know that individuals who have deletions and duplications will often meet criteria for one or more behavioral and educational diagnoses. And I've heard from parents that they say, well, once my child was diagnosed with the 1q21.1 duplication, for example, we don't know why they want to give them other diagnoses in the school. And they kind of resist having other diagnoses. But the fact is, those other diagnoses in school settings, the behavioral and educational diagnoses, are really important and may be valuable when they're appropriate for driving what types of services your child receives. So use those psychiatric, behavioral, and educational diagnoses for everything they're worth, realizing that the deletion or the duplication is the underlying cause of the learning and behavioral symptoms, but those other diagnoses are the symptoms that might help them get services that they need. And finally, schools and teachers are very unlikely to be familiar with the 16p11.2 or the 1q21.1 deletions, duplications, or other genetic disorders for that matter. And I've heard families say, well, we would like to go to a district or a school district that's familiar with our child's genetic diagnosis. But really, you can't go moving around trying to find those schools. First of all, there are not very many schools that know anything about these genetic diagnoses. And also, for a school and for teachers who don't know anything about your child's genetic diagnosis, it doesn't mean they can't provide excellent services. I have seen many, many great school districts who knew nothing about the genetic diagnoses but were able to provide excellent services. And what's most important is that they have an open mind, that they're willing to learn about the genetic diagnoses and any insights that they can gain about a child's behavior and learning from the genetic diagnosis. And they also need to be very creative to meeting the child's needs, just as they would if they didn't know the specific condition. So it's important to educate schools and teachers. It's important that they have open minds. We're learning more and more about specific behaviors and learning profiles associated with genetic disorders, and it's important that they're willing to look at those diagnoses. However, that doesn't mean that if they don't have that knowledge already that they can't do a great job. So it's really a matter of working with a school system to try to help them understand the importance. I'd like to acknowledge our team at Geisinger ADMI, including our Director, Crystalise Martin, and also Tom Chalman, who's our Medical Director, and of course Dr. David Ledbetter, who is our Chief Scientific Officer at Geisinger, and our whole team at ADMI, which really works together to try to help us bridge this gap between what we know about causes and diagnoses. And of course, our work would not be possible without the many families who help contribute to research. Thank you very much.